Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of Truth is Justice. In last week's episode, I highlighted how the treatment of the family at the centre of the Kingwood home invasion by followers of Bob's was deplorable. I also highlighted how there was little that could be done by me to correct that, other than to raise it generally. Now, rather than stop, the approach has continued, and the strategies to get the family to talk continue to be thrown around. Eventually, the discussions will move on to something else, and the Kingwood family will become old news. And that's another huge problem with the approach taken by many of these people. They are revved up by Bob, and with what is essentially a mob mentality driving them, they embark on an approach to matters with absolutely zero regard for the individuals who are the subject of their focus. As I discussed, in this instance we had a family who suffered a horrible event being pursued by a group of Bob's followers who feel they have the right to pursue that family for the purposes of Sandra's acquittal. This group are even suggesting privately that the family has an obligation, a moral obligation, to speak to Bob and answer all the questions that they, so not just Bob, but all of them, have. Now, I'll leave the analysis of the behaviour of that group to psychologists to explain, but it's so upsetting for me to see all of this behind-the-scenes strategising, the passing around of their private information, talking about ways to manufacture friendships with them with the sole purpose being to get them to speak to Bob on air. All of this happening to a completely innocent family who have only been caught up in this nonsense because they were subjected to an absolutely horrible home invasion. To suggest that they owe anyone anything, especially a for-profit podcast that has a very questionable reputation for their treatment of individuals, is so bizarre that it demonstrates to me such a twisted view of what's right and what's wrong. We've seen members of Sandra's family and friends of the family jump up and down about the treatment they have received in some forums in which they participate. The real hypocrisy here is that at the very same time they are comfortable with their group and a show dedicated to Sandra's acquittal, harassing, pursuing and breaching the privacy of an entirely innocent family. Some of the very things they have complained about they are more than comfortable doing to others, again justified in their minds because it is for Sandra. As I said, their attention will eventually turn somewhere else, and the discussion of the Kingwood family will reduce to a comment every now and then. And we've seen that time and time again on the show. We had the Costco blouse matter, for example, whereby the call was made by Bob for staff members at Costco stores or the head office to ascertain who had purchased a particular blouse during a particular time frame and provide their private contact details, so their name, their phone number, their address, etc., to Bob's followers for them to follow up on. Now that rightly caused a lot of problems. I mean, really, once shows start calling on employees at companies to release the private information of their customers, the line has been well and truly crossed. But it wasn't the problems that stopped their focus. They simply moved on to the next topic and caused a storm there. We had the Los Cucos restaurant, the focus of a large number of inquiries, and people were conducting information searches into ex-staff members who worked there in 2012. I've heard from a couple of people who actually received messages from members of Bob's group asking for the contact details of friends who worked at Los Cucos in 2012 on the basis that they could help with an investigation into a murder. Now, using language like that is so similar to law enforcement that it must be quite disconcerting for someone to receive communication like that out of the blue, especially when they have absolutely no involvement. It's almost like that is what this group feel they are, an arm of law enforcement. And that really is truly scary. Now, to those people who continue to take the investigation into their own hands and feel that it is the right thing to do to play the role of detective and law enforcement officer, I appeal to you to take a step back and seriously consider what you are doing and the consequences of your actions. Don't answer any doubt with the comment that these people you approach could simply refuse to talk, that they're under no obligation to say anything, and that makes the pursuit of them okay, because you know very well that that wouldn't work. The strategies and tactics used would just change, and the relentless pressure on these individuals would simply continue. Now, this isn't a matter of staying in your own lane, as has been the comment thrown around a bit recently. This is a matter of doing what is right and what is decent. It's the matter of treating someone how they should be treated. Following last week's episode, a few people noted that Bob has been careful to not make some of these requests of the Kingwood family publicly himself, and that's true. However, the conversations taking place behind the scenes are a very different matter. An excellent point was made in our page relating to what responsibility Bob would take, if any, if one or more of his group caused significant harm, or worse, to a member of the public through their actions. It actually isn't that hard to imagine. The level of online and offline harassment by a core group of Bob supporters is truly terrifying, and they are absolutely relentless and seemingly not restrained by anything. The feeling of power this group seems to get from having Bob behind them is of significant concern because the individuals they are harassing become entirely unimportant. The focus is on the person they are trying to acquit. Everyone else is almost dehumanised and becomes a target. And consider a situation where an individual was suffering from depression, and Bob's followers targeted that person for one reason or another. The potential consequences of that harassment are absolutely terrible. And would Bob take responsibility for that? No, I doubt it. But he does have responsibility. He doesn't condemn the actions taken by his followers, and he largely promotes the very type of behaviour that they exhibit. If you don't think the consequences of those actions can be significant, I'll highlight a case a little later that gives an example of just how bad it can be. Last week, we also played for you the closing statement by the prosecution from the trial of Joshua Young. Now, for those that aren't familiar with the case, I'll give you a brief summary of it. Trey Zwicker was a 14-year-old freshman who was murdered on the 11th of May 2011. His badly beaten body was found on the school grounds. His stepbrother Joshua was charged with his murder, but 2 years later in 2013, prior to Joshua's trial, Joshua's father, Josh Gauker, confessed to the killing, and just a month before Joshua's trial, he was sentenced to life in prison. Joshua subsequently went to trial, and the closing argument you heard was at that trial. Following deliberations, Joshua was acquitted of murdering Trey. And Joshua has had a troubled life. So since his acquittal, he's been in and out of custody, including pleading guilty to assaulting a witness who testified against him in his trial in 2012. And he's currently in federal prison on a firearms charge. Young quite famously appeared on the Dr. Phil show in 2014, along with Trey's father, Terry, and some other family members. Young denied murdering Joshua on that show and indicated willingness to take a lie detector test on the show, but decided against it at the last minute. His father appeared on the show via telephone link from the Kentucky State Penitentiary, where he repeated his original claim that Joshua had committed the murder. Now, why did I bring up this case? Well, it's a tragic story that took a significant turn just a few months ago when a letter written by Joshua was released. In the letter, Joshua confesses to the murder and provides details on exactly how the murder took place. Very similar details to those which Josh Gauker initially claimed his son had told him when he confessed to the murder shortly after it had happened, and very similar to the claims made by witnesses that testified against him at trial. Remember, the prosecutor's closing argument and the facts they presented, well, even though they were seemingly spot on, at least according to Joshua's confession, the facts presented were not successful in convincing the jury, and Joshua walked free. It's quite easy to find evidence of the verbal abuse that the prosecutor received on forums for taking Joshua's case to trial when he was innocent. Some of the abuse is quite incredible, especially given his confession. Now, I've been surprised in this case by the level of disdain for the prosecution, and not just Ms. Barnett, but virtually everyone associated with the successful prosecution of the case. And that has been communicated by Bob to his audience from the beginning of the season, and we highlighted how the basis of those verbal attacks on Ms. Barnett were false, just built on lies and misleading statements. Now, Joshua cannot be retried for the murder, given his acquittal, and that fact may lead some to argue that he was simply now making the confession for other reasons, including media attention and to get his dad out of prison. Regardless of how you interpret the confession, the letter says a lot about the ability for someone to manipulate others and to be able to rally a crowd behind them in their support. I won't read out the letter, parts of it are very graphic descriptions of the murder, but I'll put up a copy of it on this week's show notes on our website for those that are interested. Now, interestingly, Joshua seems to be very proud of his ability to convince people of his innocence, reflecting on his appearance on Dr. Phil and how he was able to fool someone with a psychology degree. And that brings me to my broader point with this. People can fool and people can lie. Accepting their lies can have very significant consequences. And this general level of disdain for the prosecution and the seeming willingness to accept the word of those claiming to be innocent is not without consequence. Generating a widespread hatred and distrust for prosecutors, law enforcement, some expert witnesses, jury members, and the courts is almost the perfect combination for someone guilty of a crime but wanting to be acquitted. And like I demonstrated a couple of weeks ago, it really doesn't take much on the part of the guilty person claiming innocence once those other elements have been established. And those elements, the distrust of the prosecution, distrust of law enforcement and some expert witnesses, distrust of jury members and the courts, they can be established without any need to be factually accurate. It can all be lies and it still works. And whilst I agree that wrongful convictions need to be corrected, and the work of groups like the various innocence projects should be absolutely applauded, for amateur groups to take up the cause of someone who has been convicted but claims innocence is a dangerous game. At the very least, many people are relieved of significant sums of money on the basis of a justified reinvestigation, and a general distrust of those groups I've highlighted is spread to relatively large groups of people. But at its worst, a guilty person is able to convince people of their innocence and require the justice system to review their case under a backdrop of enormous public pressure. Now, an interesting question was asked on Bob's Friday episode last week. The question related to the use of private investigators to interact with an individual with the purpose being to get that person to provide information on another person, all with the purpose being to help in the push for Sandra's acquittal. And whilst to some that may sound innocent enough, there is precedent for that approach, and the result was shocking. A scary reminder of the problems that these groups can cause. Thank you to Fred for bringing this to my attention. And for those that haven't seen the documentary Murder in the Park, I highly recommend it. It is essentially a reinvestigation of a reinvestigation. Now, for those that don't know the story, in 1982, Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillard were murdered in Washington Park in Chicago's South Side. Several witnesses identified the murderer, Anthony Porter. And one of the witnesses described how he had earlier in the evening been robbed by Porter at gunpoint. Porter was convicted and sentenced to death, but in 1999, just 2 days before his execution, he was not only spared from the death chamber, he was released from prison, largely because of the efforts spearheaded by David Protes, a journalism professor at Northwestern University, and his students working as part of an innocence project. The documentary demonstrates how, through the extraordinary manipulation and misrepresentation of the evidence surrounding Porter's conviction, Protes used the services of a private investigator, Paul Cialino, to coerce from another man a confession for the crime. The evidence against that man, Alstory Simon, was a videotaped confession and testimony from his angry ex-wife. All sounds like a great outcome, right? Well, that's the approach that groups like Bob's promote as being success. You have a person spared from death row, released from prison, and another person confesses to the crime and is subsequently convicted. That is, in essence, what many of the supporters on Bob's page are calling for with respect to Sandra, and the actions of Protes were very similar to what the audience member suggested in his question on Bob's show. They are hoping for someone to confess to the crime that Sandra has been convicted of, and for Sandra to be released. And we all know the lengths these people are prepared to go to. I think they would see Protes' approach as perhaps tame in comparison with their own. But obviously, that isn't the end of the story. So 15 years after his conviction, in 2014, Simon was released from prison, his conviction vacated. Following his release, Simon lodged a $40 million lawsuit against Protes, Cialino, his defence attorney, and the university, and reached a private settlement with Protes and the university. The lawsuit describes how Simon had endured and will continue to endure immense and immeasurable emotional and physical pain and suffering, all of which was proximately caused by the misconduct by Protest, Cialino, and those involved in extracting a false confession from him. The lawsuit alleged how intentionally manufactured witness statements against Simon were used, along with other illegal and deceitful tactics used to coerce from him that false confession. Interestingly, the lawsuit describes how Porter would instruct his students to investigate the case and find evidence of Porter's innocence, rather than necessarily finding the truth. And regardless of your views of wrongful convictions, regardless of your views of Sandra's innocence or guilt, this documentary is compelling viewing. And many people are of the view that the work to free a person claiming they are innocent is victimless, and no harm can be caused. This documentary demonstrates how what may start with good intentions can very easily turn into something that represents a nightmare for others and an actual wrongful conviction. A man lost 15 years of his life because people were so blindly committed to a cause that they did whatever was necessary to obtain his acquittal, including framing someone else for the crime, a person who was entirely innocent. Now, a little more digging, and the lengths that Protest and his students were prepared to go to has some shocking similarities with the approach taken by Bob and his followers. Protest left the university in 2011 to start an innocence project of his own, following some controversy over the tactics employed by his students in investigating the murder of Anthony McKinney. It's alleged that they lied about their identity to certain people to achieve certain goals, and had inappropriate and manipulative relationships with witnesses to try and get information. Think about the behaviour of Bob's followers when it comes to this case, and specifically the Kingwood case. It is the same. They are not just casually talking about it. They are laying out very specific strategies to manipulate the members of the family who suffered in that Kingwood invasion. They are talking about ways in which they could manufacture circumstances where they could befriend members of the family with the sole purpose being to obtain information to help with Sandra's acquittal. And if you're still not convinced of how the approach taken can go wrong, look up the case of Roger Keith Coleman. Now, thank you to a member of our Facebook page for bringing that case to my attention. He was charged and convicted with the rape and brutal murder of his sister-in-law, Wanda McCoy, in 1981. He famously appeared on the cover of Time magazine on the 18th of May 1992. And 2 days later, on the 20th of May 1992, Coleman was executed. Coleman's last words before his execution were these: "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight. When my innocence is proven, I hope America will realise the injustice of the death penalty, as all other civilised countries have. My last words are to the woman I love. Love is eternal. My love for you will last forever. I love you, Sharon." Sharon Paul was a college student and was the girlfriend of Coleman. Now, Coleman's assertion that he was innocent prompted Centurion Ministries, a New Jersey charity that investigates wrongful convictions, to investigate the case. The same approach was taken to what we see in other cases. Serious questions were raised over the strength of the evidence, and of course, the constant denials by Coleman resonated with so many people that his denials almost became accepted as fact. The Washington Post and some other media groups joined Centurion Ministries in an unsuccessful court fight to have the DNA tests conducted in 2000. On the 5th of January 2006, the Governor of Virginia at the time, Mr. Mark Warner, ordered the retesting of Coleman's DNA. And 7 days later, on January the 12th, 2006, the test results were released, confirming the absolute guilt of Coleman. So to quote from the report, the probability that a randomly selected individual unrelated to Roger Coleman would coincidentally share the observed DNA profile is estimated to be 1 in 19 million. James McCloskey, Centurion's executive director at the time, said that he felt betrayed by Coleman, especially given his last words before his execution. To quote McCloskey, "How can somebody with such equanimity, such dignity, such quiet confidence make those his final words, even though he is guilty?" McCloskey shared the final meal with Coleman just hours before his execution. And to quote McCloskey again, "I now know that I was wrong. Indeed, this is a bitter pill to swallow, a kick in the stomach." Coleman's own attorney was unpaid for 6 years, fighting for him pro bono on the belief that he was innocent. And that fact in itself led others to then support him. It makes a somewhat compelling argument on its own. His own lawyer believes in his innocence and is prepared to work for free, so he must be innocent, people were told. And what led to all of that publicity for Coleman? What led to his positive image? Well, for one thing, Coleman was noted as being an articulate speaker, and he presented himself very well in interviews. He appeared on talk shows, he appeared in magazines and newspapers, and became known around the world, even prompting an appeal by Pope John Paul II to stop his execution. Now, I'm not raising this case to in any way prompt a discussion on the death penalty. I'm raising it to demonstrate how a movement can believe something is right, wholly believe that something is right, yet be so wrong. So convinced by a liar that it becomes a global movement. Now, some will say that it is one thing to raise this case after the fact, now that we have evidence to show that he was definitively guilty, but that would suggest that the evidence at the time of his conviction was weak. In fact, according to the prosecution, the evidence at the time of his conviction was strong. In fact, to quote from Tom Scott, a member of the team who helped prosecute Coleman, "I never had any doubt about his guilt. Never. All the evidence always pointed to Coleman." Now, initial DNA and blood tests in 1990 placed Coleman within 0.2% of the population who could have contributed that sample. But his defence argued, and this resonated with many who fought for Coleman's innocence, that the expert who conducted those initial DNA tests had misinterpreted the results. Now, that was enough for many of those who supported Coleman to disregard the DNA evidence and focus instead on his denials and a claim of an alibi that prevented him from having the time to commit the rape and murder. Now, can you imagine if that case was around today, in the context of social media? Imagine the pressure on the prosecution and on every witness. Imagine the consequences for the family of Ms. McCoy. I thought I would read out a quote from the family of Ms. Heyman Lee, which I think addresses something that many people forget in this rush to be actively involved in investigations like Bob and his followers. And a quote from Ms. Heyman Lee's brother. "To me, it's real life. To you listeners, it's another murder mystery, crime drama, another episode of CSI. You weren't there to see your mum crying every night, having a heart attack when she got the news that the body was found, and going to court almost every day for a year, seeing your mum weeping, crying and fainting. You don't know what we went through, especially to those who are demanding our family response and having a meeting. You guys are disgusting. Shame on you. I pray that you don't have to go through what we went through and have your story blasted to 5 million listeners." I know I've probably gone on about the Kingwood matter long enough, but the reason I've done so, and perhaps why it has triggered so much attention, is probably the same as why I started this podcast in the first place. Innocent people are being used to support claims of Sandra's innocence, and they need someone to stand up for them against the wave of relentless pursuit by shows like Bob's. They need someone to highlight how their tactics are, in many instances, no better than those suggested were employed by Protas and his group of students, resulting in the $40 million lawsuit and the wrongful conviction of a man who had 15 years of his life taken from him. And we are the ones doing that. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. I'm going to briefly talk about another case that has some striking similarities to the Melgar case. And we've heard from Bob how the circumstances of Jim's murder to him point only to a home invasion or a burglary scenario, and any question of the impact that religion had on the crime is pure speculation, and in Bob's opinion not even in the realm of being possible. Now, I completely disagree, and I think we've gone some way towards explaining why. This may give you a little more insight into the arguments that have been presented and how a slight change in the facts, a female murder victim rather than a male murder victim, for example, can make a big change in how the case is perceived generally. On the 16th of January 2014, Ralph Candelario was found injured outside his home in Colorado. His wife was found inside in the kitchen, murdered. Candelario was thought to have a serious head injury, at least that was what he complained of, and was taken to the hospital, but released a short time later. He was questioned by detectives, but at least initially, the detectives believed the murder was the outcome of a brutal home invasion. And Candelario noted how he and his wife were supposed to be out of the home at the time of the murder. They had intended to catch a flight to Oregon, but changed their plans because the flight was delayed. In the early hours of the 16th of January, Candelario claims that 2 intruders entered the home and stayed for many hours. He claims that they murdered his wife and that he was able to escape. He supported his claims of homicidal intruders with a letter providing details of what he claims took place in the home that evening. Thank you to Adam for bringing that letter to our attention. We'll put a copy of his letter outlining what he believed happened up on the show notes associated with this episode on our website. It's very detailed and lengthy, but it has some very interesting elements. I'll read out the letter in a moment, and keep in mind when I do of a number of arguable similarities with the Melgar case, including that Candelario and his wife were members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's been argued that the murder was motivated in some part by elements of the faith restricting divorce. Candelario's story evolved over time, with detailed descriptions being given of the supposed intruders. He was a tall, dark-skinned man with yellow glasses and marks on his face. Candelario's claimed that items were stolen from the home, including a television and jewellery, and Candelario changed the timeline of the events significantly, adding a whole day to the timeline. His account is both very detailed and incredibly dramatic in parts. He involved neighbours in the discovery process by stumbling outside and calling for their help. His account of the events even includes suggestions by him that he couldn't believe that the neighbours were not coming to the house earlier. Candelario initially claimed the strike to his head caused him to have a loss of memory for a period of time around the attack, specifically the period of time where his wife was being brutally murdered. The murder weapon in this case almost certainly came from inside the home, and there was an attempt to wash some rugs inside the home which contained blood from the attack. And known burglars in the area were also cast as potential suspects. And now, the letter written by Candelario, who, in March 2016, was convicted for the murder of his wife Pam. To whom it may concern, the following account I am recording to the best of my memory during the week following the death of my beloved wife Pam. It is what I can remember. I must start on Tuesday evening because I had to go back and piece together the day's events one bit at a time as I could. I wish I had more time to recover, but time and circumstances won't allow that. Tuesday evening, Pam and I had dinner at about 6:30. She made chicken and rice, and we had half a glass of red wine each with dinner. Then we sat down to watch some TV. Some Frasier, some Star Trek Voyager, and White Collar. Pam took her bath at 9 p.m, and I took mine at 9:30. We were both in bed by 10:30, approximately. The morning of January 15th, 2014, at about 2:30, I got up to go to the bathroom, went out of the bedroom into the hallway upstairs and noticed the downstairs light was not on, so I went down to check why. I heard something downstairs as I got to the bottom of the railing. I turned and someone hit me in the back. I tripped forward and went toward the front door when someone else hit me in the head from the side room. I got a glimpse of this person. A tall, dark man with yellow glasses, short curly hair, wide nose, large lips, and marks on the side of his face. I could not see his eyes or ears. A moment later, I was lying on the floor, unconscious. I don't know how long I was there on the floor, but I started to hear noises. Noises upstairs, noises in the kitchen. No lights anywhere were on. I knew something was wrong. My head hurt, I was dizzy. I could not see clearly, but I tried to get up a couple of times and finally stumbled toward the kitchen. I turned the light on by the kitchen sink and found Pam lying on the floor by the cupboard. She is alive, but she is badly hurt. There is blood all over her face and all over the floor. I yelled at her, but she did not respond at all. She was breathing hard and blood was coming out of her nose and mouth. I tried to clear her mouth, but she was bleeding and it wouldn't stop. She started to convulse, and I held her hand for just a couple of minutes, and she just went quiet. I yelled at her again and just started crying. She did not respond and was no longer breathing. I just collapsed down to the floor by the sink. A moment later, the two guys ran downstairs and told me to shut up. The taller man took me to the front hall and told me to get down and to shut up. When I lay down on the floor, I was crying, and he kicked me in the side and told me to shut up. They were speaking in Spanish, but the tall one did speak to me in thick English and told me not to move or make any noise. They turned the kitchen light out. They both had some kind of LED lights on the side of their gloves. Something was wrong with them. The tall guy was talking on a phone in Spanish. I don't know what phone he was using. I could only determine he was very angry. Something was wrong with the car. I could not tell what. He told the shorter guy they would have to wait a while. He told me not to move. Some time went by. Don't know how much. He came back and asked me if I had any more money. I told him I had a couple of stashes upstairs and in the garage. He told me to go get them. He followed me to the kitchen, where I put on my tennis shoes to go out to the garage. He took out a small handgun and told me he would be watching. I went out the back and the rear door glass was broken. Some pieces fell out when I opened the door. I continued to the garage, where I tried to lift myself up into the loft. I had an old shotgun in the loft with a couple of shells, but I couldn't pull myself up. So I grabbed the $200 I had under the candle and went back out. When I turned around, I saw Fahi Trujillo's husband in the back, in his yard. I always waved him, but the tall guy was standing by the bathroom window with his gun, looking at me, so I just looked straight forward and I didn't wave. I didn't even look over. I thought maybe he might think that was strange and come check on us. Nobody ever came. When I went in, more glass fell. I was sure someone would hear. I think it was about 5 now, because there was some traffic starting to move around. Once I was inside, I told them it was cold and I needed to keep fire going. So I went back out to get a couple of pieces of wood for the stove, but I could not see Fari's husband, so I brought the wood in. When I picked up the poker to stir up the fire, I saw blood on the end of it and put it down and told them I would just turn the electric on. I turned the heater on in the TV room, but the tall guy would not let me stay. He took me to the hallway and told me to lay down and stay. I just broke down. I was crying and I was cold and I was freaked out. Pam was there with me just a few feet away. I grabbed a small pillow off a bench and a small blue knit blanket to cover myself, and I just cried. I either passed out or fell asleep exhausted and cold. The next bit of memory comes at about 11 a.m. on Wednesday morning. The tall guy was talking angrily on his phone about the kara, telling them to ondele, then cursing, puta, you puta. More, but I don't know much Spanish. They were in the TV room, and I asked if I could go to the bathroom. He followed me upstairs to the bathroom. I went to the bathroom and then washed my hands and face and saw my face was absolutely swollen above my left eye and I had a cut on my nose. I went across the hall to the sitting room and got my slippers, took off my tennis shoes and went down the hallway. I turned to go into the bedroom, but he told me no and said down. I was trying to get my phone. It was on my bedstand. He told me to lay down and be quiet. Around 1 o'clock, some glass fell out of the back door. The guys ran into the fireplace room and closed the door. I thought someone might be checking the house, but it turned out to be the wind. Still nobody. Why did no one ever come by? I still don't understand. In the afternoon, he called someone again about the kara and started cursing again, you puta, and other things. About 4 o'clock, things took a turn for the worst. The tall guy was still angry and thought he would come over and kick me. I was just resting on the floor. Then he pointed his gun at me and fired. It just clicked. I can't fully say what happened to me at that point. This continued for almost an hour. I lost all control of myself. I shit in my pajamas. I peed in them also, all over myself, and they just laughed. I was just laying there in my own shit, and they were laughing. I just broke down altogether. I passed out at some point, because when I woke it was dark outside. Only the light from the street was coming in. I thought how nice it looked, and it was quiet. But I realised I was freezing. I couldn't stop shaking. I got up and went into the TV room and lay down in front of the heater, just crying, shaking. I smelled terrible. I lay there for a while, then I decided I would try to go upstairs and try to clean myself up. But the tall guy came in from behind the fireplace room and told me to shut up and lay down on the floor. He told me, "Do you want to die?" I said no. He said, "Shut up, and I mean forever, or I will come back and finish you." I just said okay and lay back down on the floor. I couldn't help myself. I just peed all over myself again. It was more than I could deal with. I passed out again. When I awoke, the sun was coming up and light was in the house. I thought my nightmare was over, but I looked down the hall and I could see Pam's legs in the kitchen. I couldn't hear anything, and the fireplace doors were closed. When I couldn't hear anything, there was absolutely no sound. No voices, no traffic, no dogs, nothing. I was so cold and dizzy, but I got myself up and went over to Pam, and I just lost everything. I yelled, I pissed my pyjamas again, and I just went for the front door. I didn't think. I just went, maybe Milan could help. He was near. I stumbled down the front steps and saw Fari over to my right. I yelled to her for help. I was walking. I made it to the second set of steps and went down, but when I turned to go to her, I lost my balance and fell on the sidewalk and hit the right side of my head. I asked her for help for me and for Pam, to check on her, and I remember her calling 911. Then I lost focus. I was so cold on the concrete, but I was already freezing. When the paramedics arrived, I remember them talking to me, but I don't remember what. I vaguely remember them cutting my clothes off. I was shaking and I couldn't stop. The next thing I remember was the hospital. They were trying to warm me up and get an IV into me, and then they were trying to clean me up. The next thing I remember was riding in the helicopter. It just hurt my head worse. It vibrated all the way and just made me sick. When they got me to Parkview, they gave me a warm IV and blankets and some morphine for the pain, and I started to feel better. Sometime in the ER, a gentleman came over to take pictures of my injuries to my head, my ribs, my arm and my face. I can't remember his name. Also, Greg Sudar from CBI came to talk to me, to ask me what happened. I tried to tell him as much as I could, but at that time I was still in shock, and all I could really remember was getting hit in the head. I really could not remember what had all happened the last day. I thought everything had happened that morning. That's what I believed. After some more x-rays and a CT scan, the doctor said I had a concussion and said I was stable and could go home. My son Aaron came to pick me up, but Greg and Kurt Leibchen said they would give me a ride to CBI and then I could go. So I said okay. Little did I know what trauma was to unfold next and how badly I was to be treated for the next 11 hours. I was mistreated, bullied, intimidated, tortured, and coerced for the next 11 hours. Yes, I repeat, 11 hours. Kurt took me to the CBI office in Pueblo around 1 p.m. and said they needed to ask me a few questions about what had happened. I said okay. When I got there, they said they needed to take my fingerprints. I didn't understand, but I said okay. They asked me questions for about 40 minutes, I guess while they waited for something for the fingerprints. I asked if I could get a drink or something and something to eat, and if I could get my prescription. They gave me a drink but said no to everything else, and I asked Greg if I could get, at least, some Tylenol, and he said he couldn't do that. Finally, they took my fingerprints and then asked me more questions, then let me sit on a couch, and I fell asleep for a while. They woke me up later, and I was cold and asked for a blanket or some clothes, and they said no. They then took me to a small, cold room, sat me down on a cold vinyl chair, and proceeded to grill me about what happened. At first they were pleasant, and just asked what I could remember, and after a while they became rude and threatening. I was still dizzy, I was tired, I was traumatized, I was cold, I didn't have any clothes, I was also hungry. But I tried to answer the questions, and I told Pat and Kurt all that I could remember about last night. That I went downstairs to check the light and the stove, and when I got to the bottom, I got hit from behind, and I got hit in the head above my right eye, and was knocked out in the hallway by the front door. I could not remember anything until when I woke up in the morning and found Pam on the kitchen floor. I told them I went over to check on her, and she was cold and not breathing and did not respond, and that I just peed my pyjamas and ran out the front door, and yelled to Fari to please help me and check on Pam. I said I did remember the evening before when we had dinner and watched TV and took our baths and went to bed around 10:30. They seemed angry with me that I couldn't remember more, but what was I to do? I had just lost my wife. I was injured, I was hungry, I was cold, and I was not allowed my medical treatment. How could anyone think under those circumstances? I ask again, how? What I told them was accurate from my memory. I was just missing a whole day, and I couldn't figure out why. I even asked Greg why I would have dried feces on me if it had all occurred that morning. He said he didn't know. Why I smelled so bad like I hadn't showered in days, I wanted to know. Well, about 6 o'clock, Pat and Kurt finally got me a hamburger and a drink, which I thanked them for and ate, not even realising myself that I had not eaten since Pam's dinner on Tuesday night. Then they told me someone else had to come and talk to me from Denver, and it would be a couple of hours. So I leaned on my cold vinyl chair, propped my head up and fell asleep, exhausted, hurt and cold, without my medicine, without my clothes, in paper clothes, no shoes, no underwear. All I could do was sleep. The gentleman from Denver turned out to be a polygraph guy who explained he needed to give me a test, explained how to do it, and asked if that was okay. I said yes, okay. This took about 45 minutes, and he said he needed to grade the test and would come back. In a while he did, and he explained that I knew more about the evening than I was saying, which, in retrospect, is true, but I could only remember what I could remember. But then it got worse, more so than you could imagine. At about 10:30 p.m. on Thursday, Pat and Kurt came back loaded for bear. They came out and said I knew more than I was telling, and they pieced together a story for me. Then they decided to bash Pam, saying she was an alcoholic and a drunk, and that she and I had been drinking heavily and we got in an argument and things got out of hand. It gets worse. After about an hour of this, I told them I was not involved in the hurt Pam suffered, that we were happy and that we were not arguing, that we were getting ready to go on our long-planned vacation to our home in Oregon. Then they changed tactics by telling me it was okay if I agreed to self-defense. I was shocked, even insulted. They said, well, we know how it goes. She was drinking, you were drinking, she hit you, you hit her back, and this is where we are. It's okay. It's not okay. I maintained I had nothing to do with Pam's injuries, and I didn't, and I would not plea to some story Pat and Kurt came up with. It was almost 12:15 in the morning when they said I could go. I can't even imagine what I had to endure that Thursday. It still does not even register to me. I am numb, with fear, with hurt, with disgust, with loss, and on top of it all, I'm trying to recover from my own injuries, both physical and emotional. One of their comments in their conversation was I was not acting normal. I ask you, would anybody who had been through what I had been through those 2 days be normal? No, and I probably never will. I was too tired and too hurt to be angry at the time. But I have had lots of time to think about what happened to Pam and me. I am angry at the two people who needlessly took my sweetie from me and in the process destroyed my entire life. That I have to stay behind and live. I am angry at myself for not finding a way to do more, or just getting myself killed too. And I am angry at how badly the law enforcement of our community has treated my situation and the life I enjoyed with Pam. You have no idea who she was, all the good she brought to my life, but all the people around me do, and they loved her like I do. And they are the ones who have helped me to endure this injustice and the pain I feel every day. I had no choice but to face the sadness of my reality last week by planning the services for my wife and taking care of all the other things one must do in such a sad way. I didn't even get a chance to mourn properly, and I am also upset that no attention has been given to the people who did this terrible thing to Pam and me. I have given all the information to the CBI and to Kurt, including a description of the person I remember and a list of the items they took from our home. I just wanted anyone who had any questions to know what I am going through, and that I can't recount this every time for everybody. It's too much for me, so please be patient with me. Look out for yourselves and your neighbours, and please accept my heartfelt thanks for all your prayers, cards, flowers, hugs, and love. On behalf of myself and my beautiful wife, thank you all. Sincerely, Ralph Candelario. As always, thank you all very much for your support and for helping us in setting the record straight. We look forward to you joining us next week on Truth is Justice.